Bloody hell, I'll never forget the afternoon of November 18th, 1943, when I stood on the tarmac at Henderson Field, Guadalcanal, watching an American pilot casually climb out of his battered F-4U Corsair after destroying 4 Japanese Zeros in a single sortie, his 20th through 23rd victories, while chatting about baseball statistics as if aerial combat were nothing more than a sporting match. The South Pacific sun was beating down on the steel piercing, the smell of aviation fuel mixed with tropical vegetation, and Glenn Miller's Moonlight Serenade was playing from a radio in the operations tent. American music celebrating American achievements that challenged everything I'd believed about who truly controlled the skies over this godforsaken war. I was Flight Lieutenant Jeffrey Spitfire Harrington, Royal Air Force 243 Squadron, and after 3 years of combat from the Battle of Britain to Malta to Southeast Asia, I thought I understood everything about fighter pilots, about who possessed the proper warrior spirit for aerial combat, and about the natural superiority of British aviation traditions over colonial upstarts who'd only recently discovered how to build proper aeroplanes. I'd earned my nickname flying Supermarine Spitfires over southern England during the darkest days of 1940, had shot down 11 German aircraft, and genuinely believed that RAF pilots represented the pinnacle of aerial warfare excellence. But what I witnessed during those 3 months serving alongside American naval aviators in the Solomon Islands would shatter every assumption I'd held about American military competence, about who deserved credit for Allied air superiority, and about the difference between British aristocratic warrior traditions and American democratic professionalism. That American pilot, Major Gregory Pappy Boyington, would teach me that heroism took many forms, that aerial combat excellence wasn't exclusive to Oxbridge graduates, and that sometimes the loudest, most irreverent, most undisciplined pilots were also the most deadly in actual combat. My assignment to the South Pacific began on August 15, 1943, when I was transferred from RAF operations in Burma to serve as a liaison officer with American forces in the Solomon Islands. The official purpose was to coordinate British and American air operations in the region, but the unspoken objective was to learn American tactical methods and assess their combat effectiveness against Japanese opposition. "Harrington," said Group Captain Charles Montgomery during my departure briefing in Calcutta, "you'll be working with American Naval and Marine Corps aviation units who've been fighting the Japanese since Midway. I need detailed reports on their capabilities, their tactics, and their overall combat effectiveness." He paused, studying me with the expression of a senior RAF officer who understood the prejudices that shaped British attitudes toward American military forces. "I know what you're thinking, that Americans are enthusiastic amateurs who lack proper military discipline and training. But they've been holding the line against Japanese expansion for 18 months, while we've been focused on Europe and North Africa. Keep an open mind and learn what you can." His advice was sound, but privately, I doubted that American pilots could teach British aviators anything significant about aerial combat. The RAF had been fighting since 1939, had defeated the Luftwaffe during the Battle of Britain, and had established air superiority traditions that Americans were only beginning to understand. My skepticism seemed confirmed when I arrived at Henderson Field on August 20, 1943, and observed American aviation operations for the first time. The base was organized chaos, aircraft parked haphazardly around the perimeter, maintenance performed outdoors under tropical sun, and pilots lounging around in casual uniforms that would have earned immediate reprimands at any RAF station. "Welcome to Guadalcanal, Lieutenant," said Commander James Thompson, the naval aviator assigned as my escort during orientation. "I know this probably looks pretty informal compared to RAF operations, but we get results where it matters, in the air against the Japanese." His casual attitude epitomized American approaches to military discipline that British officers found disturbing. American pilots called their superior officers by first names, questioned orders they disagreed with, and maintained personal behavior standards that would have been considered gross insubordination in the RAF. "Commander," I asked, "do American pilots receive any instruction in proper military bearing and discipline? This entire operation appears rather relaxed for a combat zone." Thompson laughed, actually laughed at my question, with the kind of easy confidence that suggested he didn't take British military traditions particularly seriously. "Jeff," he said, using my first name without permission, "American pilots are trained to fight and win, not to salute properly or maintain parade ground discipline. We care about combat effectiveness, not peacetime military courtesy. This philosophy reflected fundamental differences between British and American military cultures that I would observe repeatedly during my time in the South Pacific. The RAF emphasized discipline, tradition, and hierarchical respect as foundations for military effectiveness, while Americans seemed to believe that individual competence and tactical results mattered more than formal military behavior. My initial assessment of American aerial combat capabilities was equally unimpressive. During my first week at Henderson Field, I observed several American fighter squadrons conducting operations against Japanese targets, and while their results were adequate, their methods seemed crude compared to RAF tactical sophistication. American pilots relied heavily on aircraft performance advantages rather than flying skill, using speed and firepower to compensate for inferior maneuverability compared to Japanese Zero fighters. They avoided the kind of turning combat where British pilots excelled, preferring diving attacks that maximized American aircraft strengths while minimizing pilot skill requirements. These Americans fight like they're driving lorries rather than flying aeroplanes, I wrote in my first report to Group Captain Montgomery. They use brute force and superior equipment to overcome enemies, while RAF pilots rely on superior training and tactical finesse to achieve victory. This assessment reflected British confidence in our aerial combat traditions and dismissive attitudes toward American methods that seemed to emphasize industrial might over individual excellence. But my comfortable assumptions were about to be challenged by an American pilot whose combat record and personal character would force me to reconsider everything I believed about aerial warfare and warrior culture. The encounter that changed my perspective occurred on September 12, 1943, when I was introduced to Major Gregory Boyington, commander of VMF 214, a Marine Corps fighter squadron that had recently arrived at Guadalcanal. Boyington was everything I'd been taught to despise in a military officer: loud, irreverent, undisciplined, and apparently more interested in gambling and drinking than in maintaining proper military standards. "So you're the limey they sent to spy on us," he said when we were introduced, extending his hand with a grin that suggested he found British formality amusing rather than impressive. "Hope you're ready to see how real fighter pilots operate." His casual insolence would have earned immediate disciplinary action in the RAF, but American officers seemed to tolerate or even encourage such behavior from pilots who produced combat results. When I asked Commander Thompson about Boyington's apparent lack of military discipline, his response revealed American priorities that differed dramatically from British values. "Pappy's a pain in the ass on the ground," Thompson admitted, "but he's a killer in the air. He's already got 16 confirmed victories flying for the Flying Tigers in China, plus several more since joining the Marines. We put up with his bullshit because he gets results." This pragmatic approach to officer evaluation, prioritizing combat effectiveness over military bearing, was typical of American military culture, but deeply troubling from a British perspective. How could you maintain proper military hierarchy if you tolerated insubordination from officers who happened to be skilled pilots? But my assessment of Major Boyington began to shift on September 16, 1943, when I accompanied VMF 214 on a fighter sweep over Bougainville and observed American aerial combat tactics in action. The mission briefing was informal by RAF standards. Boyington outlined the basic plan, while pilots interrupted with questions and suggestions, creating a collaborative atmosphere that would have been impossible in the hierarchical RAF command structure. "Okay, gentlemen," Boyington announced, "we're going to sweep over Kahili Airfield and engage any Japanese fighters that come up to play. Standard tactics: maintain altitude advantage, use diving attacks, never get into turning fights with Zeros." "Questions?" A young lieutenant raised his hand. "Skipper, what if we encounter more Zeros than we can handle? Do we break off and return to base?" Boyington's response revealed American attitudes toward aerial combat that emphasized survival and tactical wisdom over the kind of heroic determination that British culture celebrated. "If you're outnumbered and outmaneuvered, get the hell out of there and live to fight another day. Dead pilots don't win wars. Living pilots who learn from experience and come back for more do win wars." This philosophy contradicted British warrior traditions that emphasized fighting to the last, regardless of odds or circumstances. But as I watched the actual engagement unfold, I began to understand the tactical sophistication underlying Boyington's apparently casual approach to aerial combat. When Japanese Zeros appeared over Kahili, VMF 2114 didn't charge heroically into turning combat, where enemy aircraft held maneuverability advantages. Instead, they maintained altitude, selected targets carefully, executed diving attacks that utilized F-4U Corsair speed and firepower advantages, and broke off combat when tactical situations became unfavorable. The results were devastating for Japanese aviation and revealed combat effectiveness that exceeded anything I'd observed from RAF squadrons using traditional British tactical methods. VMF 214 shot down 7 Japanese fighters without losing a single American aircraft, achieving kill ratios that demonstrated the superiority of American tactical doctrine over traditional British approaches to aerial warfare. But what impressed me most was Boyington's personal flying skill, which far exceeded what I'd expected from someone who appeared to be an undisciplined troublemaker on the ground. His aircraft handling was superb, his tactical awareness was exceptional, and his marksmanship was deadly. He personally accounted for 2 of the 7 Japanese aircraft destroyed during that engagement. "Not bad for a colonial upstart," I admitted to Commander Thompson after we returned to Henderson Field. "That was some of the finest aerial combat I've witnessed during this entire war." Thompson grinned. "Pappy's the best natural pilot I've ever seen. He may not salute properly or follow regulations, but when it comes to fighting, he's an artist." Over the following weeks, I spent increasing time with VMF 214 and gradually recognized that Major Boyington embodied a different kind of warrior excellence than British military tradition acknowledged. He wasn't a gentleman officer trained at prestigious schools and raised in aristocratic traditions. He was a self-taught pilot who'd learned aerial combat through experience rather than formal instruction, who developed tactics through trial and error rather than academic study, and who'd become deadly effective through natural talent combined with extensive combat experience. "Jeff," Boyington told me during one of our evening conversations at the Officers Club, "the difference between American and British pilots is that you guys fight like it's a sporting match with rules and proper behavior. We fight like we're trying to kill people before they kill us." His blunt assessment challenged my romantic notions about aerial combat as a form of knightly contest where honor and courage mattered more than survival and tactical effectiveness. Americans understood that modern aerial warfare was industrial killing, conducted at high speeds with powerful weapons, not a gentleman's sport where proper behavior was more important than practical results. But Boyington's most devastating lesson came on October 17, 1943, when I observed him achieve 4 victories in a single sortie, an accomplishment that raised his total score to 20 confirmed kills and demonstrated aerial combat skills that matched anything achieved by the most decorated RAF aces. The engagement began as a routine fighter sweep over Kahili, but Japanese opposition was heavier than expected, with over 30 Zero fighters rising to challenge our formation. Most pilots would have withdrawn in the face of such overwhelming numerical odds, but Boyington led VMF 214 into combat with tactical confidence that reflected years of experience and natural fighting instincts. What followed was the finest display of fighter pilot skill I'd ever witnessed. Boyington systematically destroyed 4 Japanese Zeros through a combination of superior tactical positioning, excellent marksmanship, and aggressive flying that kept Japanese pilots defensive and unable to exploit their aircraft's superior maneuverability. But what impressed me most was how Boyington achieved these victories while maintaining awareness of his squadron's tactical situation and ensuring that other American pilots weren't left vulnerable to Japanese counterattacks. He was simultaneously an individual fighter pilot and a squadron commander, achieving personal success while fulfilling leadership responsibilities. 20 confirmed victories, Commander Thompson announced during the evening celebration at the Officers Club. That makes Pappy the highest-scoring active Marine Corps pilot and one of the top American aces of the entire war. The celebration was typically American, loud, informal, with pilots of all ranks drinking together and sharing combat stories without regard for military hierarchy. But beneath the casual atmosphere was genuine respect for Boyington's achievements and recognition that his combat effectiveness compensated for his lack of military polish. "Jeff," Boyington said during a quiet moment in the celebration, "you've been watching American pilots for 2 months now. What's your assessment? Are we as incompetent as you Brits think we are?" His question forced me to confront how completely my attitudes had changed since arriving in the South Pacific. I'd come expecting to observe enthusiastic amateurs who lacked proper military training and aerial combat sophistication. Instead, I'd encountered professional warriors who developed tactics superior to RAF methods in many ways, who'd achieved combat results that exceeded British accomplishments in similar situations, and who demonstrated that aerial warfare excellence could exist outside traditional British military culture. "Pappy," I replied carefully, "American pilots have taught me that there's more than one way to achieve aerial combat excellence, that British traditions don't have monopoly on military effectiveness, and that sometimes the most unlikely warriors are also the most deadly in actual combat." My admission represented significant evolution in British attitudes toward American military capabilities, but it also reflected broader recognition that American approaches to warfare were proving more effective than traditional British methods in many contexts. The final transformation in my understanding came during November 1943, when I observed the full scope of American aerial operations in the South Pacific and recognized how American industrial capacity and tactical innovation were achieving air superiority that British forces had struggled to maintain in other theaters. American aviation wasn't just about individual pilot skill. It was about systematic advantages in aircraft production, pilot training, maintenance capabilities, and logistical support that allowed American forces to maintain operational tempo that overwhelmed Japanese opposition through sheer weight of resources. "We produce more pilots than Japan can shoot down," explained Commander Thompson during one of our strategic discussions. "We build more aircraft than they can destroy. We develop better tactics faster than they can adapt to our innovations. Individual Japanese pilots may be more skilled than individual American pilots, but we win through systematic advantages that make individual superiority irrelevant." This industrial approach to aerial warfare was fundamentally different from British emphasis on individual excellence and traditional warrior values. Americans understood that modern war was won by nations that could mobilize industrial resources most effectively, not by nations that produced the most individually skilled warriors. But American success also reflected tactical innovations that challenged British aerial combat doctrine in fundamental ways. American pilots had developed thatch-weave defensive tactics, boom and zoom attack methods, and team fighting techniques that proved more effective than traditional British emphasis on individual combat and aircraft maneuverability. "British pilots are excellent individual aviators," Boyington told me, "but American pilots are better team fighters who understand that coordinated squadron tactics are more effective than individual heroics." His assessment was accurate and devastating to British military pride. We'd spent years developing fighter-pilot culture that emphasized individual skill and personal courage, while Americans had been developing systematic tactics that made individual excellence less important than team coordination. My final encounter with Major Boyington came on December 15, 1943, just before I was transferred back to RAF operations in Burma. By that time, his victory total had reached 24 confirmed kills, making him one of the highest-scoring American pilots of the entire Pacific War. "Jeff," he said during our farewell conversation, "I hope you'll tell your RAF buddies that American pilots aren't the amateurs you thought we were when you first arrived." "Pappy," I replied, "I'll tell them that I met the finest fighter pilot I've encountered during this entire war, that American aerial combat tactics are superior to British methods in many ways, and that the RAF has much to learn from American innovations." My recommendation shocked British aviation authorities, who'd expected my report to confirm their assumptions about American military incompetence, but it reflected honest assessment of what I'd observed during 3 months serving alongside American Naval and Marine Corps aviators. The lessons I'd learned from Boyington and other American pilots influenced RAF tactical development during the remainder of the war and contributed to improved British-American coordination in combined operations. We adopted American team fighting techniques, modified our tactics to emphasize systematic advantages over individual heroics, and recognized that aerial warfare excellence could develop outside traditional British military culture. But perhaps most importantly, my experience with American pilots challenged British attitudes toward colonial forces and democratic military culture that had shaped imperial military thinking for centuries. Americans had demonstrated that warriors didn't need aristocratic backgrounds, classical education, or traditional military discipline to achieve excellence in modern warfare. When I learned of Major Boyington's capture after being shot down over Rabaul on January 3, 1944, I felt genuine grief for the loss of a warrior I'd come to respect deeply, despite our cultural differences. His final victory total of 28 confirmed kills represented more than just individual achievement. It symbolized American approaches to aerial warfare that had proven superior to traditional British methods. My wartime service continued through the defeat of Japan in 1945, but I never forgot the lessons learned from Pappy Boyington about the nature of aerial combat excellence and the limitations of British military traditions in modern industrial warfare. After the war, I remained in contact with American pilots I'd served alongside in the Solomon Islands, and our correspondence provided ongoing insights into American military developments during the Cold War period. The U.S. Air Force that emerged from World War II incorporated lessons from pilots like Boyington, emphasizing tactical flexibility, team coordination, and systematic advantages over traditional notions of individual warrior excellence. "Jeffrey," wrote Colonel Thompson in 1950, "the Air Force we're building today reflects lessons learned from Pacific combat, that teamwork matters more than individual heroics, that systematic advantages determine outcomes, and that the best warriors aren't always the most polished gentlemen." When Major Boyington was released from Japanese captivity in 1945 and awarded the Medal of Honor for his combat achievements, I wrote to congratulate him and acknowledge how completely he'd changed my understanding of American military capabilities. "Pappy," I wrote, "you taught this British snob that heroism takes many forms, that excellence doesn't require proper breeding or classical education, and that sometimes the loudest, most irreverent warriors are also the most deadly in actual combat." His response was typically American, brief, self-deprecating, and devoid of false modesty. "Jeff, I was just doing my job and trying to stay alive long enough to fight another day. If that made me a hero in your eyes, I'm glad I could improve British-American relations." Our correspondence continued until Boyington's death in 1988, providing 43 years of friendship that began with British prejudice and grew into genuine respect based on shared combat experience and mutual recognition of each other's contributions to Allied victory. The final validation of lessons learned from Pappy Boyington came during my post-war career as an RAF instructor, teaching new generations of British pilots. I incorporated American tactical methods into RAF training curricula, emphasized team coordination over individual heroics, and taught young pilots that aerial combat excellence could develop through practical experience rather than just formal education. "Gentlemen," I would tell each new class of RAF pilot trainees, "I'm going to teach you tactics developed by an American Marine Corps major who drank too much, gambled excessively, and violated every regulation regarding proper military bearing, but he was also the finest fighter pilot I encountered during the entire war, and his methods will keep you alive while making you more effective against enemy opposition." This was my story, Flight Lieutenant Jeffrey Spitfire Harrington, who learned that British military traditions didn't have a monopoly on warrior excellence, that American pilots were professionals deserving of respect rather than colonial amateurs requiring British guidance, and that sometimes the most unlikely heroes teach the most important lessons about courage, skill, and effectiveness in modern warfare. My encounter with Major Boyington taught me that heroism took many forms, that cultural prejudices could blind us to excellence that existed outside traditional frameworks, and that former prejudices could become lasting friendships when individuals recognized each other's true character and capabilities. What struck you most about my transformation from skeptical British snob to respectful admirer of American aerial combat prowess? Have you heard similar stories from veterans who discovered that their assumptions about Allied forces were wrong? These personal testimonies help us understand how individual experiences during warfare can challenge national stereotypes and build lasting partnerships. If you want to hear more first-hand accounts like this one, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Tomorrow we'll be sharing the story of Capitaine Jacques Dubois, a French resistance fighter who learned that American Special Operations Forces brought more than just weapons to the liberation of France. These voices from the past deserve to be heard. Let's make sure their stories live on.